Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that's far from cozy. Medieval castles and stone walls might sound grand, but the reality? It was cold, grimy, and downright brutal. Forget the fairy tale nights and lavish feasts. Imagine waking up on a sack of straw, shivering inside walls that do little to keep out the damp or the smell. Your morning alarm isn't a gentle chime, but a rooster crowing or a servant shouting through the halls. So before you get too cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. And drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. You wake with a start, not because your dreams faded gently into morning, but because your back screams in protest. That old straw mattress beneath you isn't a cushion. It's a battlefield of broken stalks, dust, and ancient memories. There's no memory foam here, no cloud of softness cradling your body. Instead, you lie on a sack of dry, prickly straw, stuffed months ago and left to rot under layers of dirt, and who knows what else. The smell hits you before your eyes even open. A musty barnyard haze that clings to your clothes and skin like a second coat. It's the smell of neglect, of long winters without fresh bedding, and the countless creatures that have made this their home while you slept, or tried to. Your body protests as you move, joints stiff and aching from the cold that seeped through the stone walls during the night. There's no heating system to warm your bones, no soft blankets that could promise comfort. The woolen coverlet is rough and heavy, stained from months of use and smelling faintly of sweat and smoke. It clings to you like a punishment rather than a protection. You wonder briefly how anyone can survive this cold. Then the reality crashes back. Survive is the only option. The silence shatters abruptly, not with birdsong or the gentle stirrings of dawn, but with a shrill human yell echoing through the stone corridors. It's the castle's alarm clock, and it's terrible. Somewhere in the gloom, a servant tramps tirelessly from chamber to chamber, voice cracking with exhaustion and impatience, shouting whatever the medieval equivalent of wakey wakey is. His cries pierce the stillness, bouncing off the cold stone walls, stirring more irritation than motivation. No one likes this job, no one. But someone must drag the castle's occupants from their fitful slumbers into the cruel light of day. The rooster might crow too, somewhere beyond the thick walls, but it's drowned out by the human clamor. There are no gentle alarms, no cozy clocks here, only the relentless clang of bells or the barked commands of servants trying desperately to herd noblemen, soldiers, and common folk alike into waking. You curse the human alarm clock as you pull yourself upright, muscles stiff and protesting every inch of movement. Your bedroom, if you can call it that, is little more than a cold, drafty chamber carved from stone. The walls, while formidable against invaders, do little to keep out the chill. They absorb the damp from outside, and at times, the stone seems to sweat, sending cold drops to your skin when you least expect it. There's no insulation, no double-glazed windows, No heater humming softly in the background. Just thick slabs of stone and narrow arrow slits barely admitting any sunlight, making the room perpetually dim. Your clothing from yesterday clings to your skin, damp and scratchy. Not because you've been lazy, but because there's no other choice. Washing is a luxury, and drying is an exercise in futility when the air is so cold and thick with dampness. You try to shake off the stiffness, but your limbs feel locked in the slow rust of a forgotten gear. Privacy is a myth here. Thin tapestries hang on the walls, more for show than function, and they do little to block the chill or the prying eyes of servants who enter at odd hours to prepare your chambers or deliver messages. Your breath forms little clouds in the air as you rise, reminding you that even breathing is an act of surrender to the cold. There's no central heating, no hot water waiting in a tank. Water in the castle comes from a well or is brought in by servants, cold, grimy, and sometimes tainted by who knows what. Washing yourself is a quick, uncomfortable ritual, usually performed with water so cold it steals the last warmth from your aching muscles. Soap, if you can call it that, is a crude concoction of wood ash and animal fat, barely cleaning and often drying your skin to rawness. The morning light is a pale smear through the narrow windows, and even on a sunny day, it's weak. On overcast mornings, which are most days, darkness clings stubbornly, leaving you fumbling for your chamber pot or waiting for a servant to fetch it. Yes, chamber pots, the necessity of medieval toilets, await, often grimy and overflowing. You hold your breath as you use it, hoping not to touch the sides, knowing full well the stench will cling to your fingers despite any precautions. There's no bathroom in the modern sense. The castle's garderobe, a small room with a hole dropping waist down the walls into the moat or cesspit, is not only a stinking, drafty torture chamber, but a potential hazard. On windy days, the stench creeps back up the walls, invading even the grandest chambers. If you're lucky enough to have a private garderobe, consider yourself fortunate. Most share communal facilities that lack privacy or sanitation. And if you're unlucky, you might find yourself dashing outside into the cold morning to use a wooden bucket behind the great stone walls. The castle is waking slowly around you. Servants shuffle through corridors, lighting braziers and tending fires, their faces lined with exhaustion from sleepless nights. The kitchens burst into life with the harsh clatter of pots and the sharp tang of smoke. The great hall will soon fill with the smell of burning wood and the rough, bitter scent of gruel being prepared for the hungry crowd. But for now, it's cold and quiet, if you can call it that. Just the settling echoes of footsteps and distant voices. You dress as quickly as the biting cold will allow. Woolen layers stiff and unforgiving, often reeking faintly of smoke and damp. Your boots, if you have them, are worn thin, with soles so brittle you wonder how they last through a single winter. Most go barefoot or wear simple leather sandals, their feet toughened by years of marching across stone floors in muddy courtyards. As you prepare to leave your chamber, you pause for a moment and catch a glimpse of yourself in a cracked, smudged mirror. Your face is pale, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. The cold night has left your skin chapped and raw, and your hair sticks to your forehead in greasy strands. You want to curse this life, this stone prison of a castle, this daily ritual of discomfort and endurance. But there's no time. The day is waiting, relentless and unforgiving. Outside your door, the castle is already stirring with purpose and tension. Soldiers sharpen swords, archers prepare their bows, and servants scurry to their endless chores. The great stone fortress, with all its grandeur and might, is a harsh master. It demands vigilance, resilience, and a willingness to endure hardship without complaint. It's not a home. It's a command center, a fortress of stone and struggle where comfort is a myth and survival the only prize. And as the cold morning presses on, you steel yourself. Another day begins, not with hope or warmth, but with the harsh bite of reality. The medieval castle does not welcome you gently. It drags you from rest, from warmth, and from ease into a world of stone, cold, and unrelenting duty. You are alive, but that is all you can count on. You wake from a restless sleep, your body still stiff and aching from the night's chill, and immediately face the morning's first, and perhaps most dreaded, battle: hygiene. In the medieval castle, this simple word is less a promise of refreshment and more a daily trial of endurance, cold water, and questionable cleanliness. There are no warm showers here, no running water heated to a comfortable temperature by a flick of a switch. Instead, you are greeted by a heavy wooden bucket filled with water so cold it bites into your skin like shards of ice. This bucket is your morning adversary. It has been hauled from the well or a cistern deep within the castle. Its contents often more chill than liquid, sometimes still harboring flecks of ice from the previous night. The cold is relentless, shocking, and unforgiving. A cruel reminder that luxury is a foreign concept within these stone walls. If you are fortunate, the water has been warmed slightly by being set near the kitchen fires. Some of the more inventive castle architects tried to devise rudimentary heating systems, pipes running close to hearths to warm water as it traveled. On paper, it sounds like progress, but in practice, these systems often proved more hazardous than helpful. The pipes, usually fashioned from lead, leached poison into the water, turning a simple act of washing into a slow dance with danger. The choice was clear: endure frigid discomfort or risk the insidious effects of lead poisoning. Neither option feels like a blessing. Soap, a word that carries promise today, held a far stranger meaning in medieval times. Archaeologists have uncovered soap-making workshops, but the recipes they found read like strange alchemical experiments gone wrong. The primary ingredient was wood ash mixed with animal fat, a combination that means your supposed cleanser is essentially the residue of burnt fireplace waste mixed with grease. Imagine rubbing that on your skin, thinking it will wash away grime, when really it just replaces one layer of filth with another. In wealthier castles, there was something called Castile soap, made from olive oil instead of animal fat. It was a slight improvement, but a luxury so expensive that a single bar might cost as much as a sheep. For most, the idea of dedicating such a fortune to soap was laughable. The majority made do with ash and fat, a grimy mixture that left skin dry, irritated, and smelling faintly of smoke and barnyard. Bathing itself was a rare and complicated affair. Public bathhouses existed in some towns, but within castle walls, Baths were modest wooden tubs filled with the same cold or barely warmed water. Bathing was more ritual than refreshment, quick, often rushed, and performed with little more than a handful of scalding steam and a prayer that no one interrupts your precious moments of cleanliness. Candles flickered weakly in the damp chambers, casting long shadows on the stone walls as you scrub and rinse, trying to convince yourself that you feel better, fresher, or at least less infested. But washing the body was only half the challenge. Clothes posed an entirely different problem. Wool and linen tunics, shifts and cloaks were worn for weeks, sometimes months, without washing. When they were cleaned, it was an arduous process. Water had to be fetched in heavy buckets from the well or stream, then heated over a fire. No easy feat in a drafty stone castle where fuel was scarce and precious. Clothes were scrubbed by hand, often on wooden boards with a mix of ash and water as a detergent, then hung to dry in the unpredictable medieval weather. A sunny day was a rare gift. More often, garments hung damp and heavy, smelling of mildew and smoke. Washing clothes was not just time-consuming but risky. Wet fabrics in cold air led to chills and illness, and the rough washing methods often tore or weakened already fragile clothing. For most, the solution was simply to wear the same set of clothes again, hoping the grime and scent would fade enough to go unnoticed. The castle's lack of hygiene extended beyond the human body and clothing. The same water used for washing was often the water used for drinking and cooking. Wells and cisterns were vulnerable to contamination by runoff, waste, and sometimes even the castle's own toilets, which emptied waste directly down the walls and into surrounding moats or pits. Clean water was a constant concern and a gamble with your health. The concept of personal cleanliness was very different in this era. Frequent bathing was not just a challenge, it was discouraged. Medical and religious beliefs held that water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. Dirt, grime, and the protective layers of sweat were seen as barriers to illness. Bathing too often could strip away these natural defenses and invite sickness. So the medieval mindset favored restraint, not indulgence. This belief, combined with the harsh realities of cold water and primitive soap, meant that many went days or even weeks without a proper wash. Smell, dirt, and lice were part of life, and no amount of scrubbing could completely rid a person of these unwelcome companions. Fleas, lice, and other parasites thrived in the cramped, often unsanitary quarters of the castle, biting relentlessly and spreading disease. It was a constant, itchy battle fought silently beneath layers of clothing and straw mattresses. Despite all these hardships, some medieval castle residents did seek cleanliness where they could. Those with means might enjoy infrequent hot baths, using perfumed oils and herbs to mask the inevitable odors. But for the majority, the battle was one of survival, endurance, and managing expectations. Cleanliness was not about comfort or vanity. It was about doing what was possible in a world without plumbing, hygiene science, or modern sanitation. As you finish your cold wash, the water dripping from your skin chills you instantly. The castle's stone floor beneath your feet feels like ice, and you shiver, wrapping yourself in the only cloak or tunic you have. Your hair is still damp, clinging to your scalp and neck, and you know that within minutes it will freeze or become stiff with dirt again. The morning hygiene ritual, far from a moment of peace, is a sharp reminder of the castle's brutal reality. It sets the tone for a day where comfort is scarce and hardship constant. The bucket of icy water and the coarse soap are symbols of a life shaped by scarcity, danger, and the relentless demands of survival. You might wonder how anyone could endure such conditions day after day. But endure they did, because there was no alternative. Medieval castle life was a series of compromises and sacrifices, with hygiene being one of the most unforgiving. The cold buckets, the primitive soaps, and the ever-present threat of disease were just the beginning of the struggle that each new day would bring. And so you prepare to face the rest of the morning, wrapped in damp clothes, still smelling faintly of ash and fat, shivering against the stone walls. The battle of hygiene is over for now, but its memory lingers, icy, stubborn, and impossible to forget. Morning breaks, and with it comes a fresh dose of medieval reality. The castle bathroom. Forget everything you think you know about hygiene and privacy. In these stone fortresses, relieving yourself is an event that challenges dignity, endurance, and your sense of smell. Let's start with the chamber pot, your closest companion for the day and often the night. This humble vessel, usually a simple ceramic or metal bowl, sits under your bed or tucked in a dark corner. When nature calls, and it often does, you do your business there. But then comes the tricky part, emptying it, because castles don't have modern plumbing. Instead, the contents of chamber pots are unceremoniously dumped out the nearest window. Imagine that, you, standing in your cramped quarters, lifting your pot and tossing its contents into the air, hoping you don't hit anyone below. That hope, however, is more wishful thinking than reality. Castle life was noisy, chaotic, and crowded, and the streets or courtyards below were almost always populated by people going about their morning routines. To avoid turning unsuspecting passers-by into unwilling recipients of human waste, medieval towns and castles developed a system: a loud shout before dumping, a warning cry to alert those below. The phrase "Gardeloo" or "Gardelow," roughly "watch out below," was the medieval equivalent of "heads up." This warning was not just polite. In many towns, it was legally required. Laws were enacted to mandate shouting before emptying chamber pots, a primitive form of public safety regulation born out of necessity. Failure to yell "Gardeloo" could earn you a fine or worse, public scorn. The chamber pot ritual, however, was just one aspect of castle sanitation. More affluent residents might have had access to a guardrobe, the medieval toilet system tucked into a small room built into the outer walls of the castle. These guardrobes were simple holes, often just narrow slits in the stone wall, positioned over a moat, ditch, or cesspit below. When you sat on this medieval throne, you literally dropped your waist down the castle walls into the moat or moat-like ditches. Far from a sanitary solution, this practice turned the moat into a foul, bubbling stew of human waste, animal droppings, and whatever else found its way there. What's worse, those very guardrobes could become strategic liabilities. Enemies laying siege to the castle knew that waste disposal was no secret, and sometimes used the waste shafts to sneak into the fortress or to target defenders sitting on their porcelain seats. Talk about an unflattering entrance or exit strategy. Privacy in these bathroom affairs was virtually non-existent. Chamber pots might offer a small measure of solitude, assuming your quarters were separate, but communal latrines were a whole different beast. Most castles had latrines built along the outer walls, shared by dozens, sometimes hundreds, of residents and staff. Imagine a long bench with holes cut into it, set above a pit or a running stream. There were no partitions, no doors, no walls, just a row of people taking care of business shoulder to shoulder. The air in these latrines was thick with a stench so foul it could strip paint from wooden beams. Conversation was possible, if not awkward, but everyone was acutely aware of the complete lack of privacy. This was life in medieval sanitation, a world where personal space was a luxury and social norms bent to the harsh realities of survival. The communal latrine was more than just a bathroom. It was a social hub, a place where gossip traveled as freely as the waste below. Records from the time mention disputes arising over seating arrangements at latrines, as proximity to the lord or lady, even in such an undignified place, was a status symbol. One can only imagine the awkwardness of a nobleman and his servants sharing a latrine bench, negotiating their social ranks even in these most basic acts. The dangers of such shared spaces extended beyond embarrassment. Latrines were breeding grounds for disease, their open design allowing flies and vermin to multiply unchecked. The stagnant pools of waste below attracted rats and insects, which in turn carried plague and other illnesses. The unsanitary conditions contributed to the spread of deadly diseases that swept through castles and towns alike, turning what should have been a private relief into a public health crisis. Despite these grim realities, castles needed their sanitation systems. The sheer number of people living and working within the walls, from nobles to servants to soldiers, made it imperative to have a way to dispose of waste. The alternatives were far worse. Waste piled up indoors or outside the gates, attracting vermin and creating unbearable conditions. So the chamber pots, guard robes, and latrines, however crude and smelly, were essential components of castle life. In this ecosystem of filth and necessity, etiquette evolved too. As mentioned, you had to shout before emptying a chamber pot. In some places, strict rules dictated when and where waste could be dumped. Breaking these rules could lead to fines, social shame, or even violence. There were complaints in castle records about people recklessly dumping waste at inappropriate times, causing dangerous slips or hitting unsuspecting victims below. Some towns even established night watchmen tasked with monitoring waste disposal to maintain order and cleanliness as much as possible. The guardrobe's design also reflected a grudging nod to practicality. Positioned high above moats or cesspits, it kept the waste away from living quarters, helping reduce indoor odors. But the stench was still overwhelming, especially in summer when heat intensified the smell. Castle inhabitants quickly learned to hold their breath or find ways to mask the smell with herbs or incense, though these were mere palliatives against a pervasive problem. The dual-purpose nature of castle windows adds a final twist to this tale. Narrow slits built into thick stone walls served not only as defense mechanisms for archers and crossbowmen, but also functioned as makeshift bathroom windows. Castle designers didn't prioritize natural light or ventilation. Their goal was protection and practicality. So, while arrows might fly through these apertures in times of war, so too did the contents of chamber pots and the daily detritus of castle life. To modernize, the idea of tossing waste from windows onto the streets or into moats is shocking and unsanitary, but for medieval castle residents, it was simply reality. The phrase, "watch out below," was not a joke or metaphor, but a vital warning, a daily call to survival in a world without toilets, sewers, or privacy. So, as you imagine the dawn chorus of castle life, the shouts, the clanging armor, the creaking doors, don't forget the less glamorous sounds and smells. The splash of chamber pots emptied too late, the murmur of voices over latrine benches, and the ever-present call of Guardaloo echoing through stone corridors. These were the true rhythms of medieval mornings, grounding life in all its gritty, uncomfortable, and utterly human reality. The morning sun barely filtered through the narrow slits of the great hall's stone walls when the castle stirred to life. The sharp clang of the kitchen bell echoed faintly, signaling the start of the day's most anticipated yet simultaneously dreaded event, breakfast. But unlike the comforting aromas and endless options you might expect in a modern home, the medieval castle's breakfast was a grueling lesson in hierarchy, survival, and culinary compromise. At the head of the great hall, where the heavy wooden table bore the scars of countless feasts and frowns, the lord and his family prepared to take their seats. Their arrival was met with hushed reverence, a silent acknowledgement that the morning meal was more than just nourishment. It was a reminder of rank and privilege. While the Lord's plate would soon be heaped with freshly baked bread, roasted meats, and the rarest of fruits, the rest of the castle's inhabitants faced a far humbler spread. For the lower ranks, servants, guards, and laborers, breakfast meant pottage. This thick, gloopy stew was made from whatever vegetables and grains could be scrounged from the larder. Sometimes, it was a medley of boiled cabbage, onions, and turnips, overcooked until flavor was all but eradicated. Other days it might be little more than watery mush, simmered with the remnants of old herbs or vegetables that were on the edge of rot, but still technically edible. It was, in essence, the culinary equivalent of wearing hand-me-down clothes. Practical, functional, but never appealing. The concept of freshness was a luxury lost on medieval cooks. Without refrigeration or effective preservation, food was often days or even weeks old by the time it reached the table. Meats hung in smokehouses, cured with salt, but even these were vulnerable to spoilage and insect infestations. Bread, the cornerstone of every meal, was a mixed blessing. Made from coarse rye or barley flour, it was often supplemented with less appetizing fillers like sawdust or ground acorns during bad harvests to stretch supplies. This bread wasn't soft and fluffy. It was hard, dry, and more akin to a brick than a comfort food. But it wasn't just food on the table that drew attention. The bread itself played a unique role. Instead of plates, nobles ate off trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that had been left to harden over several days. These trenchers were plates, serving as a base for the food and absorbing sauces and juices. After the meal, the trenchers were often passed down to the poor or the castle's animals, a small mercy for those who couldn't afford even the simplest bread. The hierarchy extended not only to what was eaten, but to where one sat. The closer you were to the Lord's table, the more esteemed you were considered. Seats at the far end, near the drafty stone walls, were reserved for those of lower status, a clear signal that proximity equated to importance. The Lord didn't just get first pick of the food. He had the first, second, and often third choice, ensuring his plate overflowed while others settled for the leftovers. This system was strictly enforced, and any attempts to bypass the protocol could lead to swift and sometimes violent reprimands. Among the noble breakfast fare, roasted meats were a prized delicacy, though rarely abundant. Occasionally, a platter of freshly killed game, deer, boar, or pheasant, would grace the table. But these were reserved for the highest ranks and special occasions. Exotic fruits like figs or pomegranates, imported at great expense, were status symbols meant to impress and flaunt wealth rather than simply to satisfy hunger. Most castle residents, however, would never taste such luxuries. Porridge and pottage, dull and flavorless as they were, sustained the many who served the castle day in and day out. To modern palates, this meal might seem unappetizing and meager, but in medieval times, it was a lifeline. The effort of the kitchen staff to stretch limited resources into something edible was a constant battle against spoilage, pests, and the ever-looming threat of hunger. The kitchen itself was a flurry of activity long before dawn. Cooks and kitchen boys worked in near darkness, stoking fires and hauling water from wells, their faces grim and clothes stained from endless hours of labor. Maintaining the supply of food was a logistical challenge of enormous scale. Records from some castles indicate that kitchens processed thousands of calories per person per day, an astonishing figure compared to modern standards. Yet this vast quantity didn't translate into quality or taste, just volume. One of the more unusual aspects of medieval dining was the practice of repurposing stale bread as trenchers. These bread plates, once worn thin and hardened, were a form of recycling born of necessity. After several days of use, they were considered inedible and distributed to the poor. Imagine biting into a rock-hard slab that had served as your plate, then handed off as charity to someone barely better off. It was a cycle of survival that reinforced social divides at every bite. In terms of beverages, water was seldom trusted. The castle's well was often contaminated by runoff and waste, making beer the preferred choice, even at breakfast. Small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew, was consumed by all ages as a safer alternative. Its bitter taste and mild buzz were considered a necessary compromise to avoid waterborne illnesses. Wine, while present, was reserved for the upper echelons and special occasions. Despite the grimness, the breakfast ritual in the Great Hall held social and political significance. Seating arrangements, the order of service, and the distribution of food reflected and reinforced the castle's rigid social hierarchy. Every loaf, every spoonful of pottage was a reminder of where one stood in the complex web of medieval society. So as you imagine the Great Hall at dawn, the chill in the air, the rough-hewn wooden tables, the flickering torches casting dancing shadows on stone walls, remember that breakfast was never just about food. It was a daily theater of power, survival, and social order, where the king's first pick of bread and meat was a quiet proclamation of who truly ruled the castle. And for the rest, a tough morning meal that offered little comfort, plenty of challenges, and a reminder that life in a medieval castle was anything but easy. The floors of a medieval castle were nothing like the polished stone or polished wood you might imagine from movies or tourist brochures. Instead, they were layered with something called rushes, long blades of grass, reeds, and herbs gathered from nearby fields and wetlands, spread thick across every inch of the great hall, corridors, and chambers. This wasn't just a decorative choice. It was a practical, if imperfect, solution to the cold, damp stone and the grime that came with living in a fortress built to withstand sieges rather than comfort. Fresh rushes were laid down in thick mats during spring or early summer, but they weren't replaced often. Instead, fresh bundles would be scattered over the existing layers throughout the year, which meant that beneath your feet lay a year's worth of compressed grass, mud, animal droppings, spilled food, and whatever else had fallen to the floor. Over time, these layers turned into something less like a carpet and more like a slowly fermenting compost heap. The smell was unavoidable. Even with the occasional sprinkling of herbs like lavender, mint, or thyme, meant to mask the odors, the castle floor was a pungent, ever-present reminder that cleanliness was not the medieval castle's strong suit. The herbs helped, sure, but they were more like a thin veil over a much stronger stench. Imagine a mix of damp earth, rotting vegetables, animal musk, and the less definable aroma of decades of castle life, compressed into one thick mat beneath your feet. Worse yet, these rushes were rarely cleaned or replaced thoroughly. Doing so would require removing all the furniture and belongings from a room, a massive undertaking that simply wasn't practical given the constant hustle of castle life. Instead, the castle inhabitants tolerated the layers of dirt and decay, walking atop a slowly festering floor that inevitably collected fleas, ticks, and other pests. The rushes became a breeding ground for all manner of insects, and their decomposing nature made it impossible to keep the air fresh. Imagine stepping into the great hall in the dead of winter. The cold stone beneath the rushes would seep upward, chilling your feet despite the thick layer of grass and herbs. The smell, sharp and dank, would cling to your clothes, your hair, and your skin. You'd learn to live with it because there was no alternative. Stone floors without rushes were freezing and treacherous, and dirt floors inside a castle were unthinkable. So the rushes stayed, a necessary discomfort. Animals contributed their own notes to this medieval floor bouquet. Cats prowled for mice beneath the rushes. Dogs sprawled by the fire and tracked mud and grime inside, and even chickens or small livestock might wander indoors, leaving behind droppings and feathers. Sometimes the prized falcons of the nobility would roost indoors, occasionally relieving themselves on the nearest table or tapestry, adding to the chaotic symphony of smells and textures. Tapestries which adorned the stone walls tried to combat some of this dampness and chill, but they were often stained, never washed, and themselves became little ecosystems. Dust, bugs, and mold thrived on the fabric, releasing their own faint odors and adding to the castle's olfactory complexity. But the rushes on the floor were the real star of this grim show, holding the history of every spilled drink, dropped morsel, and tracked in mud from countless feet and paws. Stepping onto these rushes was a gamble. You never quite knew if the patch underfoot was still fresh or had begun to rot. A misstep might sink your foot into a soft, soggy patch or send a cloud of dust and dried bits of detritus flying. The rushes were often trampled and flattened where the castle's busy inhabitants paced, danced, or rushed from one room to the next. Yet the fresh smell of crushed herbs underfoot, when you were lucky enough to find it, could offer a momentary reprieve from the pervasive dankness. The annual rush replacement was a major event, sometimes marked with as much ceremony as the planting or harvest festivals. Entire rooms would be cleared, and fresh cuttings from nearby meadows would be laid down in thick layers, fresh and green, releasing a sharp, grassy scent that temporarily transformed the castle's dank interiors into something more bearable. But this freshness was fleeting. Within weeks, the rushes darkened, compressed, and began their slow descent back into the same damp, smelly mess. The rushes weren't just a flooring material, they also served practical purposes. They helped to absorb spills, insulate against cold floors, and provided some cushioning against the hard stone. But all their benefits came at a cost. Years of accumulated grime that no amount of herbs could fully mask. And if you happened to be unlucky, you might find yourself stepping into a puddle left by a clumsy servant or a roaming animal, adding a soggy, unpleasant surprise to your morning. The castle staff often worked to maintain the rushes as best they could, sweeping away loose dirt and replacing the top layer of herbs. But the deeper layers were impossible to clean without a full overhaul. This meant that beneath the surface was a century of castle life captured in compressed layers: mud, dust, decayed plant matter, and the less definable remnants of medieval existence. So every time you lifted your foot, kicked a stray piece of straw, or tripped on a hidden lump beneath the rushes, you were stepping on a living history. It was a smell, a texture, and a state of being that reminded everyone in the castle that their surroundings were far from pristine. Life in a medieval fortress was an ongoing battle against the elements, the smells, and the messes that centuries of human habitation created. Despite all this, the rushes played an unspoken role in the castle's daily rhythm, cushioning the harsh footsteps of soldiers, softening the echoes in stone corridors, and even providing a subtle background fragrance that, while far from pleasant, was unmistakably medieval. To the residents, this living carpet was both a nuisance and a necessity, an enduring symbol of a time when comfort was rare, survival was paramount, and every step carried the weight of history beneath it. Animals in medieval castles were more than just companions or work animals. They were an unavoidable part of daily life, often blurring the line between pet, pest, and downright nuisance. Imagine living in a place where the boundaries between human, beast, and vermin were as tangled as the stone walls themselves. Take the noble's prized falcon, for example. These birds of prey were status symbols, prized for their hunting prowess, and trained to swoop and soar with precision. But despite their grace, falcons were not exactly the cleanest guests. It was not uncommon for a falcon to relieve itself right on the dining table during a feast, much to the dismay or resigned amusement of those present. This was hardly a scandal. It happened often enough to be considered just another quirk of castle life. Imagine the scent, the shock, and the frantic attempts to clean up mid-meal, all while the falcon's piercing eyes watched from its perch. Beyond falcons, cats were a staple in medieval castles, but not for cuddles. They were hunters, employed to keep the rat and mouse population under control. These feline residents prowled silently through the corridors and hidden corners, stalking their prey with quiet efficiency. Their presence was essential, though their methods sometimes left their own mark. Scratch marks on wooden furniture, fur in unexpected places, and the occasional midnight yowl that startled even the most battle-hardened guards. Dogs also roamed the castle, serving as both companions and protectors. But unlike today's pampered pets, medieval dogs had a rougher existence. Many were working dogs, used for hunting, herding, or guarding. They were as likely to be muddy and flea-ridden as they were loyal and protective. Their constant presence meant mud and droppings tracked into the great hall and chambers, adding to the ever-present castle aroma. But the most unwelcome and notorious castle inhabitants were the rats and mice. These rodents were not just pests. In some cases, they were unwitting contributors to the castle's chaotic character. One castle's library, for instance, was reportedly haunted, not by ghosts, but by rats with a peculiar taste for literature. Historical records describe how these rodents showed a curious preference for nibbling on cheese-making manuals, leaving the rest of the valuable manuscripts remarkably intact. This peculiar dietary choice earned them a reputation as unintended literary critics, rewriting the library's collection one nibble at a time. The librarians, desperate and perplexed, were left to devise ever more creative means of rodent control, from cats to traps. But the rat readers remained a stubborn problem. The rats were more than just a nuisance. They were vectors of disease, carriers of fleas and plague that could sweep through the castle with devastating effect. Their presence was a constant threat to the health of every inhabitant, from the lowliest servant to the Lord himself. Yet, despite the danger, the rats thrived in the nooks and crannies, feasting on scraps, gnawing through stored grain, and nesting wherever they could find shelter. Sometimes the rodents' activities lent the castle an eerie atmosphere. There are tales of rats dragging scraps of parchment, rearranging piles of documents, and creating a nightly ruckus in the quietest hours, adding to the sense that the castle was alive with more than just human secrets. The so-called haunted library wasn't haunted by spirits, but by these persistent and oddly cultured invaders. Chickens, geese, and occasionally pigs would wander indoors too, blurring the line between barnyard and household. These animals were usually penned outside, but the castle's open floor plans and communal living spaces meant they often found their way inside. Their droppings, feathers, and general disarray were just another layer in the castle's pungent symphony. Imagine trying to enjoy a quiet evening by the hearth while a chicken clucked nearby and a pig snorted from the corner. Other creatures less welcome, but just as persistent, included bedbugs, fleas, and lice, all thriving in the crowded, often unhygienic conditions. These tiny pests infested mattresses, clothing, and hair, turning even the simplest night's sleep into a torment. scratching, and itching were constants, and despite all efforts, these pests were nearly impossible to eradicate. Nobles and peasants alike shared the misery of these unwelcome roommates. Even more unusual guests sometimes made their presence known. There are accounts of bats nesting in castle rafters, their fluttering wings and shrill cries adding to the castle's unsettling nighttime soundtrack. Spiders, snakes, and other critters found refuge in dark corners, contributing to the castle's reputation as a place where one had to be constantly alert, not just to human enemies, but to the many small creatures making their home within the stone walls. Despite all the challenges, animals were an integral part of castle life. They served practical roles: falcons for hunting, cats and dogs for pest control and protection, livestock for food and labor. But they also added an unpredictable, often chaotic element to daily living. Every nobleman's prized falcon came with the risk of an untimely mess. Every mouse caught was a small victory against an overwhelming tide. This uneasy coexistence shaped the rhythms of the castle. Morning might begin with the crowing of roosters, but it also included sweeping away the night's animal tracks and cleaning up the inevitable mess left behind. Feasts and celebrations were punctuated by the occasional squawk or bark, reminding everyone that even in the grandest halls, the wildness of nature was never far away. In the end, the animals of the castle were more than just pets or pests. They were characters in the daily drama of medieval life. Their presence brought unpredictability, mess, and sometimes danger, but also companionship and purpose. From the falcon's regal flights to the rat's literary escapades, the castle was a living ecosystem, vibrant and unrefined, a place where humans and animals coexisted in a messy, complicated, and unforgettable dance. Medieval castle walls were never the pristine, polished stonework you see in movies. Instead, they were living, breathing structures, sometimes literally, because the dampness that seeped through those thick stone barriers created an entire ecosystem of its own. Imagine walls so soaked with moisture that they sweat like a human in the middle of a summer joust. This wasn't just unpleasant. It was a serious problem that affected everything inside the castle, from the health of its inhabitants to the very air they breathed. Stone was chosen for its strength and defense capabilities. Thick and unyielding, these walls were built to repel invaders, withstand sieges, and stand for centuries. But stone doesn't breathe in the way wood or plaster might, and in damp climates, like much of medieval Europe, the stone absorbed moisture from the outside air. Rain seeped into cracks, condensation gathered on surfaces, and without modern insulation or heating systems, that moisture had nowhere to go but inside. This meant the interiors were often cold, clammy, and perpetually damp. The walls weren't just damp, they became habitats for all sorts of unwelcome tenants. Mold flourished in the moist conditions, spreading its fuzzy black, green, and white patches across every surface it could find. The smell was unmistakable, a dank, musty odor that clung to the stone and lingered in the air, mixing with the smoke from the hearths and the less than pleasant scents from daily castle life. Mold wasn't just a nuisance, it was a health hazard. Respiratory issues, chronic coughs, and a general feeling of malaise plagued many castle residents. Yet there was little understanding or remedy available. To combat the cold, damp stone, medieval castle dwellers turned to a surprisingly stylish and practical solution: tapestries. These massive woven artworks weren't just decorative splashes of color meant to impress visiting dignitaries. They served an essential function. Hanging heavy tapestries along the walls created a barrier between the cold stone and the interior air, trapping some of the chill and reducing drafts. They helped keep rooms warmer, or at least less icy, in a time before radiators and central heating. But tapestries came with their own set of problems. They were expensive and time-consuming to produce, requiring skilled weavers and high-quality materials like wool and silk. Nobles would commission tapestries that depicted heroic battles, religious scenes, or mythological stories, both as status symbols and as a way to narrate their family's legacy. These textiles added a richness and grandeur to otherwise stark castle rooms. Over time, however, the tapestries themselves became little ecosystems. They trapped dust, soot, and the ever-present moisture, turning into breeding grounds for mold, moths, and all manner of insects. Once vibrant and colorful, many tapestries gradually faded, frayed, and became homes for bugs and rodents. Cleaning them was difficult. Washing meant risking damage, and exposure to smoke and soot from fires only worsened their condition. So they became part of the castle's natural patina, their beauty overshadowed by decay and infestation. The presence of mold and damp also affected the castle's wooden furnishings, floorboards, and ceilings. Wood warped and rotted, creating creaking noises that echoed through the halls at night. Paintings and decorative carvings suffered from moisture damage, flaking and peeling away to reveal the bare materials beneath. Even metal fixtures rusted more quickly, forcing the blacksmiths to work overtime just to keep doors, hinges, and locks functional. In some of the wealthier castles, attempts were made to reduce the effects of dampness, but the technology and knowledge simply weren't there yet. Chimneys and hearths helped a bit by circulating warm air, but fireplaces could only do so much against the penetrating chill. Some castles experimented with placing rushes or straw beneath floorboards or layering walls with plaster, but these were imperfect solutions at best. The smell inside the castle was a complex blend. The dampness and mold mingled with the scent of burning wood and animal hides, the musk of unwashed bodies, and the lingering odors of food and waste. For the medieval nose, this was normal, home even. But by modern standards, it would have been overpowering. Visitors might wrinkle their noses and try to mask the scent with strong perfumes or herbal sachets. But the castle's aroma was as much a part of its character as the towering battlements. Castle life was a constant negotiation with these elemental realities. Every effort to make the stone walls bearable was a temporary fix, a battle against an invisible and relentless foe. The tapestries, despite their drawbacks, represented a blend of necessity and artistry, a way to humanize a cold fortress and provide a semblance of warmth and comfort amidst the raw stone. Living in a castle meant accepting that mold and damp would be your constant companions. Your clothing might cling to you from the moisture in the air. Your breath might fog in the cold rooms. Your skin might itch from the pervasive mold spores. Nobles could afford to retreat behind thick tapestries and rich furs, but even they were not immune to the castle's harsh environment. So, the next time you admire the grand halls of a medieval castle, picture not just the grandeur, but the underlying struggle. The battle against stone that breathes dampness, walls that nurture mold as easily as they do legends, and tapestries that serve as both shields and shelters. It was an environment where beauty and decay coexisted, where art met necessity, and where every thread and stone told a story of resilience in the face of relentless moisture. Medieval castles were monuments of power and protection, but they were also homes battling the unforgiving elements, walls that breathed, tapestries that held more than just images, and an interior life shaped as much by dampness as by grandeur. Medieval castle kitchens were nothing like the pristine, stainless steel culinary sanctuaries you see on cooking shows today. Instead, they were chaotic, noisy, and often downright hazardous places where the art of survival was baked into every meal. With no refrigeration, no freezers, and no modern food safety standards, the kitchen staff faced a relentless challenge: how to feed hundreds of hungry mouths using limited resources, all while trying to disguise the telltale signs of spoilage. Imagine a vast stone chamber filled with smoke and heat so intense it feels like stepping into a furnace. Huge hearths blaze day and night, their fires never fully dying, fueled by endless piles of wood and coal. Blackened pots hang over the flames, simmering stews and boiling broths that have been cooking for hours, or sometimes days, without a break. The air is thick with a pungent mix of spices, burning wood, animal fats, and the unmistakable scent of meat that's been hanging a bit too long. In this smoky haze, cooks and kitchen hands shout over the clatter of utensils, the roar of the fire, and the endless demands of the castle's hungry occupants. Without refrigeration, preserving food was less science and more desperate gamble. Fresh meat was a rare luxury, often reserved for the lord and his closest guests. When it was available, it was typically hung in cold, dark larders, sometimes salted heavily or smoked to delay spoilage. But these methods only bought a little time. As meat aged, it started to develop strong, off-putting odors and odd textures that today would send anyone running for the hills. Medieval cooks had to be creative to make these questionable cuts edible. Enter the spice rack. Spices were the unsung heroes of the medieval kitchen, wielded like magic potions to mask the sour tang of meat on the edge of ruin. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron were scattered liberally into dishes, not just for flavor, but to camouflage what the nose would otherwise reject. These exotic spices were incredibly expensive, often imported from far-off lands, and their presence was a status symbol as much as a culinary necessity. The heavier the use of spice, the more it signaled wealth, and the more it distracted from the less than fresh ingredients lurking beneath. The daily grind in the kitchen was relentless. Staff worked around the clock in shifts, chopping, stirring, and cooking enough food to satisfy everyone from the lord and his family to dozens, sometimes hundreds, of soldiers, servants, and guests. The head cook, often known by intimidating nicknames like the Terror of Turnips, was responsible for orchestrating this frenzy of activity, managing not just food, but the entire workforce, from sauce makers who specialized in their tangy concoctions to turnbrokes, typically small boys tasked with turning the spits that roasted meat over open fires. Food preparation was a messy business. Bones, fat trimmings, vegetable peels, and spoiled scraps piled up quickly. There were no trash bins or modern waste disposal systems to contain the mess. Instead, castle kitchens had a tradition that might horrify today's health inspectors. Anything unwanted was tossed directly out the kitchen windows. This practice created what one medieval writer delicately called the castle's own personal mountain of interesting aromas below the battlements. Down on the castle grounds, these heaps of kitchen waste attracted all kinds of unwelcome visitors: rats, stray dogs, and various scavengers drawn to the smell. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The accumulation of rotting food waste created breeding grounds for disease-carrying pests and contributed to the overall unsanitary conditions inside and outside the castle walls. Yet, despite the risks, the kitchen staff had little choice. The alternative was to let the refuse pile up indoors, which would have been even more intolerable. The kitchen's chaos didn't end with food preparation. Cooking in massive quantities over open flames required constant vigilance to avoid disaster. Spills and grease fires were frequent, and the risk of burns or scalds was ever present. Records from some castles describe the kitchen as a battleground where workers dodged boiling pots, hot embers, and flying sparks, all while shouting instructions and warnings. Yet, amidst the turmoil, the castle kitchen was a hub of life and activity. It was where staff bonded through shared hardship, where recipes evolved by necessity, and where the medieval art of cooking was practiced with fierce dedication. Despite the primitive conditions, cooks took pride in their craft, striving to create meals that, at least for the Lord and his guests, were worthy of the castle's grandeur. Not all food was spoiled or bland, of course. Medieval recipes called for bold flavors and elaborate presentations, especially during feasts. Spices, herbs, and rich sauces were layered to impress dignitaries and demonstrate wealth and power. Dishes might include roasted meats, exotic fruits, and even elaborate food sculptures called subtleties. Showpieces crafted from marzipan or sculpted pastry, sometimes hiding live birds that would take flight when the dish was cut open, much to the astonishment and occasional terror of guests. But for the vast majority of castle inhabitants, meals were simpler, often repetitive, and far from fresh. Pottage, a thick boiling stew of whatever vegetables and grains were on hand, was the staple, simmering in the same pot day after day. Bread was coarse and sometimes stretched with sawdust or ground acorns to make it last longer. And the daily ration of food was as much about survival as it was sustenance. In this high-stakes environment, the kitchen was also where ingenuity flourished. Cooks experimented with preservation methods, sometimes dangerously so. There are accounts of pipes intended to heat water for baths, or cooking being made from lead. A slow poison that was the unintended consequence of medieval innovation. Similarly, certain spices were not just flavorings, but preservatives, a kind of medieval insurance policy against illness. When the kitchen doors finally closed at the end of the day, the cleanup began. Or rather, the preparation for the next day's chaos. Soot-streaked walls, grease-coated counters, and floors slick with spilled fats were the norm. Cleaning was a tedious and imperfect process. Water was scarce, and soap was crude, often made from ashes and animal fats. The kitchen's perpetual state of grime was accepted as part of its character. So while the castle might have looked imposing and magnificent from the outside, its heart, the kitchen, was a world of constant struggle and uneasy survival. Feeding a medieval castle was a high-pressure balancing act between scarcity, spoilage, and spectacle, where cooks had to be part magician, part firefighter, and all grit. The next time you savor a perfectly cooked meal in a modern kitchen, remember the castle cooks of old. Their tools were primitive, their conditions brutal, and their challenges immense. Yet somehow, amidst the smoke, spice, and chaos, they managed to keep the fires burning and the larders stocked, an essential, if often overlooked, backbone of medieval life. In the medieval castle, toilets were less about comfort and more about strategy. While we think of waste disposal today as a quiet, private affair, in those days it was a weapon, a hazard, and sometimes even a defensive tactic. The guardrobe, a fancy name for the medieval castle toilet, was an unholy blend of sanitation and siege warfare, a potent mix that could turn the tide of battle without a single arrow fired. The guardrobe was typically a small chamber built into the thick castle walls, positioned above the moat or a deep pit. At first glance, it might look like a simple convenience for the lord and his court, but its true purpose was far more sinister. When nature called, waste would be dropped through a hole directly down the castle walls into the moat or ditch below. It was crude, messy, and smelled absolutely terrible. But that stench was no accident. It was a biological weapon of medieval design. Imagine an enemy army camped just beyond the castle's walls, ready to launch a siege. They'd be faced not only with archers, boiling oil, and murder holes raining down rocks, but also with a stench so overwhelming it could send them fleeing. Chroniclers from the period described the unbearable smell of these guard robes as a powerful deterrent. Attackers often found themselves overwhelmed by the foul odors wafting from the castle walls, so much so that some abandoned their sieges entirely. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was an early form of biological warfare, wielded by castle defenders in a way that modern generals might admire. The smell wasn't just an unpleasant side effect, it was carefully cultivated. Residents of the castle knew their waste contributed to the fortress's defense, and in a grim sort of pride, they accepted the role they played in this olfactory onslaught. The moat below wasn't just a water barrier, it was a cesspool of human refuse, animal waste, and kitchen scraps, all mingling to create a toxic environment that discouraged any attempts at crossing or undermining the walls. But guard robes weren't the only means of waste disposal, and not everyone in the castle was fortunate enough to have one. Many residents relied on chamber pots, simple buckets or bowls used indoors during the night or in private chambers. These pots were emptied, often without ceremony, by tossing their contents out of windows, much to the horror of anyone unfortunate enough to be below. To manage the chaos and avoid surprise showers of human waste, medieval cities enacted laws requiring people to shout warnings before emptying their chamber pots. "Gardy-loo," or "watch out below," became common cries echoing through narrow streets, a public service announcement in a world without sewage systems. Despite the warnings, Accidents were frequent, and the streets of medieval towns were infamous open sewers, rivers of filth flowing alongside pedestrians and livestock. Communal latrines were another feature of medieval sanitation, though calling them latrines might be generous. Often built into the outer walls of castles or in the courtyards, these shared toilets were little more than holes or trenches where multiple people relieved themselves side by side. Privacy was non-existent. Modesty was a concept foreign to these arrangements. Conversations, laughter, and sometimes disputes would erupt as strangers sat shoulder to shoulder over the cesspool below. These latrines required constant maintenance, or at least the work of those with the least enviable job titles. The gong farmer, as they were known in England, was the unfortunate soul tasked with cleaning out the waste from the castle's cesspits, usually working under the cover of darkness to spare others the assault of the smell. Despite the unpleasant nature of the work, gong farmers were relatively well paid, sometimes earning more than skilled craftsmen. Their role was vital. Without them, castles and towns would quickly become unlivable swamps of filth. The biological hazards of such waste management were immense. Disease was rampant, spread not only by fleas and rodents attracted to the refuse, but also by contaminated water sources. Castle wells and moats, often fed by rainwater or nearby streams, were frequently polluted by human waste. This contributed to outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and other deadly illnesses that could ravage a population faster than any invading army. Yet, despite these dangers, medieval people adapted. They developed superstitions and rituals around waste disposal, believing that certain odors could ward off evil spirits or prevent infestations of pests. The very stench of the garderobe was thought to repel moths and protect valuable garments hung nearby. The term garderobe itself reflects this dual function, part toilet, part closet, part fortress against decay. In times of siege, the garderobe's offensive capabilities took center stage. Defenders would sometimes toss more than waste down on attackers. Boiling oil, hot sand, quicklime, and even beehives found their way through the murder holes in garderobes. The noxious cocktail of smells and pain was designed to break enemy morale and create chaos. These tactics show how every element of castle design was weaponized, turning the seemingly mundane act of waste disposal into a tool of survival. For castle inhabitants, the smell was a constant companion, a reminder of their precarious existence. The odor of decay and filth was so embedded in daily life that it shaped behaviors, from the layout of living quarters to the timing of meals. Visitors might be warned of the castle's perfume, a blend of human waste, animal musk, and smoky hearth fire that clung to tapestries, stone walls, and even clothing. Despite the hardships, there was a practical side to this stench-filled defense. In an age before chemical warfare and modern artillery, anything that could discourage an attacker was valuable. The garderobe's pungent legacy is a testament to medieval ingenuity, turning the unpleasant into a weapon. So next time you think about medieval castles as majestic stone fortresses, remember the garderobe lurking in the walls, the foul-smelling biological barricade that repelled armies and defended kingdoms. It was brutal, smelly, and far from glamorous, but it was as much a part of castle life and defense as knights in armor and archers' bows. The battle for survival wasn't just fought on the battlements or in the great halls. It was waged daily in the stinking depths of the guard robe, where waste became warfare and the smell of victory was literally in the air. Medieval castles weren't just grand stone houses. They were fortresses built with one clear purpose: survival. When you lived in a castle, you weren't just defending your home. You were guarding your entire world against relentless threats. And the architects of these stone giants knew exactly what they were doing, crafting walls and defenses that could turn an enemy's attack into a nightmare. The first line of defense was the walls themselves, massive, thick, and nearly impenetrable. These weren't just a few feet thick. Some castle walls measured up to 20 feet wide at the base, a monumental barrier designed to withstand battering rams, siege engines, and even tunneling attempts. Imagine trying to break through a wall so thick that a single arrow had to thread a needle-sized slit to reach inside. That was no accident. These arrow slits, or loopholes, were narrow vertical openings designed with lethal precision. Archers inside the castle could fire out, targeting attackers with surprising accuracy, while remaining almost completely shielded by the stone surrounding them. Hitting a target as small as a dinner plate from 200 yards through a slit less than a few inches wide was the mark of a skilled archer. And some became legendary for their deadly precision. But the irony was that many of those same archers could barely hit the castle latrine if they aimed broad daylight. Above the gates and entrances, you'd find what medieval architects called murder holes. As grim as the name sounds, these were some of the most ingenious and terrifying defensive features of the castle. Imagine walking through a seemingly secure doorway, only to be met with a hailstorm of boiling oil, rocks, or even sand poured down on you from above. These murder holes were designed as trapdoors in the ceilings of entryways and passages where defenders could unleash a torrent of destruction on attackers trapped below. The effectiveness of these holes was legendary, and records from 14th century castles list supplies specifically kept for this gruesome purpose. Barrels of boiling oil, bags of quicklime that could blind enemies, and even angry beehives, which defenders would drop to unleash a swarm of stinging insects on unsuspecting invaders. Such creativity wasn't just for show. In the brutal reality of medieval warfare, every advantage counted. When a siege dragged on for months, defenders would rely on these architectural weapons to thin enemy ranks without risking themselves in hand-to-hand combat. The psychological impact was just as important. Knowing that stepping through a castle gate could mean sudden death from above certainly made attackers think twice. But the castle defenses didn't just rely on heavy stone and traps. The design of the castle itself was a strategic weapon. Take spiral staircases, for example. These weren't randomly shaped or artistic flourishes. They were carefully engineered to give defenders the upper hand. Staircases typically spiraled clockwise going upward, favoring right-handed defenders wielding swords. Attackers, often coming up the stairs with their right hands restricted by the central column, struggled to maneuver while defenders moved freely, slashing down from above. To make things worse for invaders, the steps were intentionally made uneven in height and depth. This subtle trick meant attackers unfamiliar with the stairs would stumble, trip, or lose balance, making them easy targets. One medieval chronicle even tells of an entire attacking force routed simply because they tumbled down the stairs like drunken geese. It was home field advantage built into the very bones of the castle. Defenses also extended beyond the walls to the moat, a watery barrier designed to keep invaders at bay. But moats were not just passive ditches filled with water. Some castles had ingenious systems to flood or drain their moats quickly, turning the ground around them from solid to liquid or vice versa within an hour. For an attacking army, this sudden change could be disorienting and dangerous. One moment the ground feels solid, the next you're sinking into water or mud, easy prey for defenders. The operators of these drawbridges and water controls held critical roles. History records the occasional mishap. Drawbridges raised prematurely stranding soldiers outside or dropped too early, trapping livestock or even causing chaos among the defenders themselves. One Welsh castle's drawbridge famously trapped half a cow in the mechanism, resulting in what was described as a very awkward afternoon for all involved. Even the best defenses could suffer from human error. Inside the walls, every person had a role to play during a siege. Soldiers, servants, and even children were pressed into service. Children might be messengers or water carriers, learning the harsh realities of war early in life. One record amusingly notes children turning the siege into a game, throwing rotten vegetables at each other from different towers. The castle staff, meanwhile, had to deal with cleaning up the aftermath, which was far from glamorous. But in the chaos of a siege, every action counted. The greatest strength of a castle wasn't just its stone walls or boiling oil, it was its ability to endure. Sieges could last months, sometimes years. Castles stockpiled food, weapons, and everything needed to survive long periods of isolation. One castle's inventory listed emergency rations including 500 arrows, 200 barrels of salted fish, and oddly enough, 3 juggling balls. Even in the middle of a siege, entertainment was considered essential, a small comfort amid the uncertainty and danger. In the end, a castle was more than just a home. It was a military fortress, a symbol of power, and a machine of survival. Its walls, slits, holes, and moats formed a complex system designed to repel the relentless threats of the medieval world. For those who lived inside, the castle was both sanctuary and prison, a place where every stone and spiral staircase carried the weight of defense, duty, and the constant shadow of war. When a castle was under siege, life inside wasn't just about holding the walls. It was about surviving the endless wait. Food became the currency of hope and desperation. Castles had to be prepared to withstand months, sometimes years, of isolation. Stockpiling provisions wasn't a casual affair. It was a matter of life and death. Larders were packed to the brim with salted meats, dried fish, grains, and barrels of whatever could last the longest. Fresh food was a luxury long gone once the gates were sealed. Meat, if it made it inside at all, was salted or smoked so heavily it was barely recognizable, more like leather than lunch. Vegetables were often root crops that stored well in cool, dark cellars. Bread was dense and stale, rationed carefully to stretch through the long months. Records from some castles paint a picture of meticulous inventory management. One fortress's stockpile included not only hundreds of barrels of salted fish and thousands of pounds of grain, but also, curiously, 3 juggling balls. It's an odd detail, but it tells a story about how people coped with siege life. When your world shrinks to stone walls and suspicion, and the future feels uncertain, keeping morale up becomes as important as maintaining the battlements. Entertainment in a medieval siege was far from glamorous. There were no concerts, no movies, just the clang of armor, the whispered prayers, and the constant tension. But humans have always found ways to distract themselves from fear and hunger. The juggling balls, likely used by the castle's entertainers or jesters, were a small but vital source of relief. A brief laugh, a moment of amazement at a skillful toss, a break from the harshness outside and the dread within. Jesters held a unique place during these times. More than just comedians, they were morale officers, their antics a shield against despair. Their jokes, songs, and tricks reminded everyone, from lord to servant, that life still held joy, even in the shadow of death. Laughter, rare and precious, became a weapon as powerful as the arrows defending the walls. Castle staff worked around the clock, juggling not just balls, but endless tasks: cooking, cleaning, repairing, tending the wounded, and preparing defenses. The kitchen was a chaotic hub where the head cook orchestrated meals from meager supplies, trying desperately to create something nourishing out of salted fish, dried legumes, and whatever root vegetables remained. Food had to be rationed with military precision. One mistake could mean starvation. Water was another precious resource, often rationed and carefully stored. Wells inside the castle had to be guarded and maintained, because without water, even the strongest walls couldn't hold. Siege life also meant dealing with the psychological warfare, fear, boredom, and the crushing uncertainty of when or if help would arrive. Letters were scarce, news even scarcer. Inside, rumors swirled like smoke, some true, most not. Every creak and shadow was cause for alarm or hope. Despite the grimness, castles were communities. People shared stories, sang songs, and held on to rituals that connected them to a life beyond the siege. These moments of humanity were a fragile but essential lifeline. In the end, survival during a siege depended on much more than stone and steel. It required resilience, resourcefulness, and a stubborn spark of hope. The juggling balls and jesters may seem like small details, but they remind us that even in the darkest hours, people fought not just to live, but to keep their spirits alive. Knights, squires, and guards formed the backbone of any castle's defense, each playing a unique role in the relentless rhythm of medieval life. The knight stood at the top, an image of chivalry and power. But behind the shining armor was a grueling daily grind far from the romantic tales told in storybooks. Training to become a knight began early and was brutal. Boys started as pages, learning the basics of horsemanship, weaponry, and etiquette. As squires, their duties multiplied, polishing armor, tending to horses, and assisting knights in everything from battle preparations to donning their heavy gear. The process was slow and demanding, often lasting years, with a steady stream of harsh lessons delivered through sweat, bruises, and sometimes outright failure. It wasn't just about learning to fight. It was about mastering discipline, endurance, and loyalty. Knights weren't just warriors. They were managers of their own small armies, trainers of squires, and players in the endless political games of the castle. When not fighting in battles or tournaments, much of their time was consumed by ceremonies, court duties, and maintaining their equipment. Records show that polishing armor could take hours, a task both painstaking and necessary, as a knight's reputation was tied to the gleam of his gear. Standing in rain or mud during lengthy ceremonies wasn't unusual, and complaints about the monotony of such duties fill some medieval diaries. Castle guards, meanwhile, bore the more monotonous but no less important burden of daily vigilance. Most spent their days standing watch, a seemingly endless task of appearing alert while battling boredom and fatigue. Some castles mandated guards sing or call out periodically to prove they were awake, an early, imperfect solution to the risk of dozing on duty. One guard's log from 1387 candidly complains about a fellow's terrible singing, calling it an attack on the castle's auditory sensibilities. The guard's role wasn't glamorous, but their presence was a crucial deterrent against surprise attacks, theft, or internal disorder. Off-duty, the guards lived under the same strict hierarchies and expectations as the rest of the castle staff. Their lives were a constant balancing act between maintaining readiness and navigating the complex social web of the fortress. In times of siege or unrest, guards often doubled as soldiers, ready to fight alongside knights and men-at-arms. Their equipment might be simpler, their pay lower, but their loyalty and endurance were just as vital. Squires, caught between childhood and knighthood, were perhaps the most overworked. Their days began before dawn and stretched long into the night, filled with laborious chores like cleaning stables, sharpening weapons, and managing the knight's armor and clothing. They also received combat training, practicing swordplay, archery, and horsemanship whenever possible. The physical and mental demands were intense, and the threat of injury or failure loomed constantly. Despite the hardship, becoming a knight was the ultimate goal, a ticket to status, power, and a place in history. Though the romanticized image of the knight is one of glory and honor, the reality was far grimmer. Battles were brutal and deadly, but the battles off the field, endless training, maintaining armor, court politics, and the harsh expectations of medieval society could wear down even the toughest warrior. The lines between soldier, servant, and symbol blurred, and every member of the castle's martial workforce had to navigate this complicated reality. From the lowest guard to the highest knight, loyalty to the lord and the castle was non-negotiable. Desertion or failure was met with harsh punishment, sometimes death. The fortress was a fortress, not only against external enemies, but also against weakness within. Discipline was strict, and the pressure to perform relentless. In the end, the castle's defenses were more than walls and weapons. They depended on the endurance, skill, and sometimes sheer stubbornness of these men who trained, stood watch, and fought, day and night, in rain or shine, in peace and war. The knights, squires, and guards were the living shield, the pulse, and often the unsung heroes of medieval survival. Castles weren't just grand stone fortresses. They were bustling mini-cities, alive with the noise, grime, and chaos of hundreds of people, all working together to keep things running. Behind the towering walls and royal chambers lay a complex web of jobs, some noble, many tedious, and all essential. The castle staff formed the hidden machinery, each playing a role that might sound bizarre today, but was absolutely vital back then. Take the Gong Farmer, for example. It's a title that sounds like it belongs in a fantasy novel, and in a way, it does. The Gong Farmer's job was to clean out the castle's latrines and cesspits, a task so foul it was usually done under the cover of darkness. These workers dealt with human waste, often in conditions that would make modern sanitation workers cringe. Despite the stench and danger of disease, Gong Farmers were surprisingly well compensated, sometimes earning more than skilled craftsmen. It was one of those unpleasant but necessary roles that kept the castle habitable. Then there were the kitchen staff, a constant whirlwind of activity. Feeding hundreds of mouths was no small feat. The castle kitchen operated around the clock, preparing thousands of calories per person each day. Specialized roles existed, like the sauce maker, whose entire job was to create the myriad sauces that masked questionable meat flavors. There was the turnbroke, often a young boy, tasked with turning the roasting spit over the fire, an exhausting, repetitive job that could lead to dangerous accidents if the fire flared up unexpectedly. The kitchen was a chaotic, fiery hub, with workers rushing to prepare meals while avoiding burns, spills, and the occasional out-of-control kitchen fire. Wake-up callers were another quirky but essential group. Long before alarm clocks, these castle servants had the responsibility to rouse everyone from nobles to guards, sometimes shouting through the halls or knocking on doors until their charges got up. Being a wake-up caller might seem minor, but it was critical to the daily schedule and could earn the caller a surprisingly important place in the castle hierarchy. There were keepers of the wardrobe who did more than just look after clothes. They managed the storage, repair, and organization of garments and textiles, often acting like early accountants. Their work was meticulous and vital, especially in noble households where appearance was closely tied to status and political influence. The blacksmith, another key figure, wasn't just hammering out swords and armor. They repaired everything from the knight's helmet to kitchen utensils, working with metals, fire, and an endless list of demanding tasks. Blacksmiths often kept detailed logs of repairs, and some complained about the impossible requests, like making dragon-shaped door handles, a fanciful order from a lord who clearly loved a bit of flair, no matter how impractical. Every job came with its own frustrations and hazards. Servants, guards, cooks, and artisans alike faced long hours, grueling labor, and the constant pressure to keep the castle functioning seamlessly. The complexity of castle life meant that no role was truly small. Each person's work was a thread in a larger tapestry of survival, comfort, and power. Despite the challenges, some positions had unexpected perks. The groom of the stool, for example, was responsible for assisting the king with his most private needs, including chamber pots and personal hygiene. While it sounds like a humiliating job, it was actually highly sought after, because it granted intimate access to the monarch and often led to political favor. Castles were strange worlds where status and survival intertwined in unusual ways. The staff kept the great fortress alive behind the scenes, making it more than just stone and mortar. They were the hidden heartbeat of medieval life, navigating the grime, hierarchy, and endless demands to make the impossible work, day after exhausting day. Behind the towering stone walls and the imposing great hall, the true power of a medieval castle often rested not with the lord, but with the lady of the castle. Far from the delicate image painted by romantic tales, she was the medieval equivalent of a CEO, human resources manager, and military commander rolled into one. Her day was a relentless juggling act, balancing everything from food supplies to feuding servants, from healthcare to defense strategy. Managing the castle's budget was no small feat. Medieval records reveal that ladies kept meticulous accounts, tracking everything from the number of eggs laid by the chickens to how many arrows the archers wasted shooting at birds instead of enemies. One surviving ledger even included a note scolding the archers for their drunken poor aim. Stop paying them when drunk. Food was a constant concern. Planning meals months in advance was critical to avoid famine during sieges. Orders for thousands of salted fish, hundreds of chickens, and enough grain to feed hundreds for months weren't unusual. The lady had to negotiate with merchants who didn't always respect expiration dates or laws. Her financial skills were as sharp as any merchant's, and she was responsible for balancing the needs of nobles, soldiers, servants, and sometimes the local community. Disputes among castle staff were constant, and the lady acted as the ultimate HR manager. Complaints like cooks refusing to work with bakers because the bread was too hard, or maids fighting over who had to clean the jester's hat after it fell in the moat, were documented in castle records. She had to maintain peace in a household filled with conflicting personalities, endless gossip, and the high stress of castle life. Keeping the staff cooperative was essential for survival and comfort. Her authority was absolute, and her word could make or break careers, even if it was often accompanied by a sharp tongue or a pointed glance. When the lord was away, often off at war or attending court, the lady stepped into the role of military commander. History shows that many castle ladies led successful defenses during sieges, sometimes holding off attackers for months with cunning tactics and fierce determination. One clever lady reportedly used empty wine barrels to create the illusion of a larger army, buying critical time until reinforcements arrived. She was responsible not just for managing the home, but for ensuring its survival in the face of violence. Her leadership was the backbone of the castle's resilience. Healthcare was another of her domains. Most ladies maintained gardens full of medicinal herbs, knowing which plants soothed headaches and which could accidentally poison an entire household. Medieval medical knowledge was rudimentary, but the lady's role was vital in tending to the sick and injured. She often coordinated with the castle's resident physician or healer, overseeing remedies that ranged from herbal salves to bloodletting. The well-being of the household, and by extension the entire castle, depended on her vigilance. The lady's responsibilities extended even to education. She taught her own children, and often the children of other nobles who were sent to the castle as part of their training. Records show frustrated notes about trying to teach proper table manners to unruly young lords still wielding swords at the dinner table. Beyond etiquette, She was expected to impart lessons in governance, religion, and the social graces required to survive and thrive in a medieval court. Despite her immense duties, the lady of the castle was often overlooked by history, overshadowed by kings and knights. Yet her influence shaped the daily life and long-term fate of the castle and its inhabitants. She was the quiet power behind the throne, managing chaos with discipline and grace. In a world where survival depended on order and control, the lady of the castle was the ultimate multitasker. She held the purse strings, settled disputes, directed defenses, tended to health, and raised the next generation, all while navigating the politics of a harsh and unforgiving age. Her role was complex, demanding, and indispensable. Without her, the castle could not endure. Medieval medicine was a strange blend of superstition, crude science, and brutal rituals that would make any modern doctor cringe. If you thought a visit to the doctor today was unpleasant, imagine sitting in a drafty stone chamber where your healer's tools were as likely to harm as help. The remedies ranged from the bizarre to the downright terrifying, and the idea of first do no harm was more of a hopeful suggestion than a rule. One of the most infamous treatments was the use of powdered human skull. Yes, actual ground-up skull stored in special cupboards in some castles like precious medicine. It was believed to have potent healing powers, prescribed for everything from headaches to wounds. Alongside this macabre ingredient were mixtures involving crushed beetles, powdered emeralds, and even powdered mummy. Yes, ancient Egyptian mummies shipped across continents to be ground into remedies. These concoctions were often mixed with wine or honey, which probably helped more as an antiseptic than the mystical powders themselves. Surgery was another chapter of medieval horror. There was no anesthesia, no sterile environment, and no antibiotics. Patients were expected to endure excruciating pain as barbers, who doubled as surgeons, wielded dull knives and hot irons. One recorded procedure involved shaving a chicken's bottom, then strapping the poor bird to the patient's head, waiting until the chicken showed signs of illness, supposedly absorbing the fever. It sounds insane, but surprisingly, some patients survived these rituals. How much of that survival was luck or the body's own resilience is anyone's guess. Bloodletting was the go-to cure for almost any ailment. Medieval doctors believed that health depended on balancing the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and too much blood was often blamed for fevers and excess energy. So, out came the lancets and leeches to drain life itself from the patient. There's a record of a knight who was so enthusiastic about jousting that doctors decided to cure him by bleeding. The result? Less enthusiasm. Probably because he was too lightheaded to charge the field. It was as effective as it was cruel. Dental care was equally grim. Without modern dentistry, toothaches were dealt with by either pulling the tooth or filling it with lead. Yes, lead, a known poison. But medieval practitioners didn't understand its dangers. One knight even chose to have all his teeth pulled before going into battle, preferring no distractions from pain while fighting. Imagine enduring a battlefield with a mouth full of gaps and no painkillers. Despite the horrifying methods, some medieval cures accidentally worked. Herbs used in salves and poultices sometimes contained natural antibiotics, and the alcohol in medicinal wines helped clean wounds. One castle physician proudly claimed his cure-all mixture of wine, honey, and herbs healed everything from headaches to combat injuries. Whether it was the concoction or sheer chance, some patients did get better, giving medieval medicine a confusing reputation for both cruelty and occasional success. Infections, though, were a constant threat. Without knowledge of germs or sanitation, even minor wounds could turn deadly. Fevers often meant imminent death, and many treatments only worsened the patient's condition. When remedies failed, prayers and last rites followed swiftly, marking the grim limit of medieval healthcare. Medieval medicine was a world where faith, fear, and fumbling science collided. It was brutal, bewildering, and sometimes deadly, but it was the best they had. Patients endured sharp blades, toxic powders, and strange rituals with a mix of hope and desperation. And somehow, despite it all, a few survived to tell the tale. Medieval nights in a castle were far from peaceful. As the sun slipped below the horizon, the fortress transformed into a world of shadows, creaks, and whispered fears. Darkness ruled, not just because the sun had set, but because lighting was a precious commodity. Candles were scarce, expensive, and fiercely rationed. A castle's monthly candle bill could easily eclipse the entire household's bread budget. So, once the last flicker died, most rooms were swallowed in near-complete darkness, leaving inhabitants to navigate halls by memory and the occasional sputtering torch. Night patrols were a grim necessity, but not exactly comforting. Guards were tasked with roaming the labyrinthine corridors, lone figures armed with little more than a torch that barely cut through the gloom. The flickering light cast monstrous shadows that seemed to creep along the walls, distorting tapestries and suits of armor into sinister shapes. More than once, a guard mistook his own reflection in polished armor for a specter. One castle diary entry humorously records a guard shouting at what he thought was a demon, only to discover it was the Lord's new suit, which promptly required repairs. The poor guard was forced to cover the costs by working extra shifts, a punishment for his attack on the Lord's prized possession. Ghost stories were more than just entertainment. They were part of castle life, taken seriously enough to warrant official protocols. When a ghost was sighted, it wasn't whispered about in secret, but had to be formally reported in writing. Guards documented apparitions meticulously, down to the attire the ghost wore. One such report complained bitterly about a ghost in the North Tower, dressed in last season's tunic. Clearly a style faux pas that called for a spectral wardrobe update. The ghost, apparently offended, vanished in what the report described as a huff. This blend of superstition and humor reveals that even medieval people had a way of coping with the unknown. Some parts of the castle were notorious for supernatural activity, requiring extra patrols and hazard pay for the brave souls assigned there. Certain tapestries were said to move of their own accord, and guards claimed they had sentient qualities, silently judging anyone who passed. The night watchmen had the unenviable job of facing these eerie occurrences alone, making their work both physically and psychologically taxing. Haunted locations ranged from libraries where books mysteriously shifted overnight to kitchens where spectral chefs were blamed for foul smells and ruined supplies. One castle's kitchen ghost reportedly concocted the worst-smelling stews at midnight, frustrating the staff who suspected nighttime snacking guards rather than actual spirits. Rats, ever-present and surprisingly literate, were known to rearrange books in the haunted library, favoring cheese-making manuals above all else. Despite all these spooky tales, the dark was dangerous for reasons beyond ghosts. The threat of real attackers, accidents, and getting lost in the maze of corridors was ever present. Guards had to stay alert, even when their imaginations ran wild. The castle at night was a place where fear of the tangible and intangible mixed, each feeding the other. For the residents, candlelight was a small comfort, but it was carefully conserved. Too much light meant emptying precious resources, and too little left you vulnerable to the terrors of darkness, both real and imagined. As such, life at night was a balance of bravery, superstition, and the shared hope that morning would come soon enough to chase away the shadows. In this twilight world, the castle was not just a home or fortress, but a realm where the living and the spectral seemed to brush shoulders. Ghosts, whether real or imagined, were part of the story of medieval knights, reminding everyone that sometimes the darkest battles were fought not with swords, but with shadows. Dungeons were the castle's darkest secret, literally and figuratively. Tucked deep beneath stone floors, these cramped, cold chambers were the ultimate punishment for those unfortunate enough to cross the wrong lord or break the wrong law. There was no soft landing here. The air was thick with dampness and despair, and the only light often came from a tiny barred window high above, too small to do much more than remind prisoners of the freedom they'd lost. Medieval dungeons weren't designed for comfort or even basic hygiene. Floors were uneven stone, often slick with moisture or worse. Prisoners shared their cells with rats, fat, fearless rodents that thrived in the darkness and saw humans more as inconvenient roommates than threats. These rats gnawed on anything they could find, scraps of food, tattered clothing, and sometimes even the prisoners themselves. The chilling thought of being nibbled on while trying to survive added a whole new level of terror to imprisonment. Food was scarce and barely edible. A stale piece of bread, sometimes a bowl of thin, watery gruel, and the occasional scrap of meat if the prisoner was lucky, or unlucky enough to be a political pawn with a benefactor. Meals were dropped through small openings or slid under heavy doors, often accompanied by rats scurrying to snatch leftovers. Drinking water was fetched from a nearby well or cistern, meaning it was as likely to be contaminated as it was to quench thirst. Surprisingly, some prisoners used their time in captivity to find ways to improve their situation, or at least make it bearable. Some inmates became entrepreneurs in their own grim way. They traded favors, smuggled messages, or bartered scraps of food. Others tried to keep their minds sharp by teaching each other skills or practicing storytelling. A forgotten poet might compose verses from memory, while a disgraced knight could teach swordplay tactics to a younger inmate, all while dreaming of freedom. Escape attempts were frequent, but rarely successful. The dungeon's design worked against them. Thick walls, iron bars, and guards who knew every crack and shadow made slipping away a near impossible feat. Yet prisoners never stopped trying. Some plotted elaborate tunnels, others tried to bribe guards or create distractions. The sheer will to escape was a testament to human resilience in the face of dire circumstances. Not all prisoners were criminals in the modern sense. Nobles caught in political struggles, accused witches, or debtors might find themselves locked away alongside common thieves and murderers. The dungeons were less about justice and more about control, a place to break spirits and silence opposition. Rumors of torture chambers and secret oubliettes, cells so dark and isolated that prisoners were forgotten, added to the chilling reputation. Despite the horrors, dungeons were also places of unexpected humanity. Guards occasionally showed mercy, slipping a bit of extra food or letting a prisoner speak with visitors. Some prisoners formed friendships born of shared misery, bonding over the flickering shadows cast by a single candle. In those moments, the dungeon walls seemed less like a prison and more like a twisted refuge. Life in the dungeon was a daily battle against cold, hunger, and isolation, with rats as ever-present, unwelcome companions. It was a place where hope was scarce but never fully extinguished. For every prisoner, the dream of sunlight, fresh air, and freedom burned as fiercely as the biting cold that surrounded them. The dungeon was a harsh reminder of the price of power, politics, and survival in the medieval world, where sometimes the greatest fight was simply to stay alive another day. Castles weren't just grim fortresses of stone and steel. They were alive with noise, color, and the occasional burst of chaos, thanks to the castle's entertainers. In a world ruled by harsh realities, laughter and spectacle weren't just luxuries, they were lifelines. Jesters were the heartbeat of this twisted social circus, masters of chaos wrapped in motley and bells. They weren't merely fools, they were sharp observers masked by humor, skilled at towing the line between comedy and insult without losing their heads. Their jokes could lighten the mood after a long day of brutal labor or tense council meetings, but cross them, and the consequences were just as harsh as the Lord's wrath. Musicians filled great halls with the sounds of lutes, harps, and flutes, trying to drown out the ever-present clatter of clanking armor and the occasional groan of a soldier nursing a fresh wound. Their melodies were the backdrop to feasts, celebrations, and sometimes mourning. Minstrels were often traveling performers who could spin a tale, sing a ballad, or stir a crowd with drum beats, turning even the most somber gathering into a momentary escape from reality. Then there were the tournaments, violent, glorious, and utterly chaotic. Jousting wasn't always the polished sport we imagine today. Sometimes it resembled a wild free-for-all where knights clattered into one another with reckless abandon. Horses skittered and stumbled on muddy grounds, and the crowd roared with a mix of excitement and horror. Variations included bizarre contests like tilting at rings, where knights tried to spear small hoops while riding at full speed, or mock battles where the rules were as fluid as the ale flowing through the crowd. These events were as much about spectacle and status as they were about skill and bravery, and losing could mean humiliation, or worse. Off the battlefield, dice games were a favorite pastime. Dice were carved from bone or wood, often uneven and prone to rolling unpredictably, but that only added to the thrill. Gambling was widespread among nobles and soldiers alike, sometimes spiraling into desperate bids to win food, favors, or even freedom. The addictive clatter of dice on wooden tables echoed through smoky chambers, and fortunes were won and lost in the flicker of a candle's flame. Cheating was rampant, but often overlooked if the stakes weren't too high, or if the player was influential enough. Entertainment in the castle was a constant balancing act between relief and risk. A well-timed joke or a rousing tune could uplift spirits and forge bonds among wary allies, but too much revelry could lead to disorder or offend powerful egos. Jesters sometimes used satire to expose court intrigues, their humor a dangerous tool that kept the nobility on edge. Musicians and performers depended on favor, living precariously between adoration and banishment. In a place where life was uncertain and death could come from a poisoned blade as easily as from hunger, these moments of entertainment were precious. They weren't just distractions, they were survival tools. The castle's laughter, music, and games stitched brief seams of joy into the harsh fabric of medieval life, reminding everyone that beneath the armor and beneath the stone walls, there was still a need to breathe, to smile, and sometimes, just for a moment, to forget. Mealtime in a medieval castle wasn't just about filling empty stomachs. It was a high-stakes social event loaded with unspoken rules, power plays, and enough grease to slick an entire banquet hall. From the moment the food hit the table, everyone was locked into a delicate dance of etiquette, status, and survival. The way you ate, where you sat, and even how much salt you sprinkled on your bread could say more about your place in the kingdom than your family name. Tables were long, narrow boards perched on trestles, covered with rough linen, or sometimes nothing at all. Instead of plates, people ate off wooden trenchers, basically stale, hard bread slabs that doubled as plates, and later, snacks for the poor or animals. These trenchers soaked up juices and sauces, turning into soggy, greasy sponges by the end of the meal. Fingers, inevitably greasy and sticky, were the primary utensils. Forks were rare curiosities, and knives were mostly tools for cutting, not eating. You learned fast to master the art of dipping bread into stews or wiping sauce from your chin without offending the Lord's guests. Seating arrangements were far from random and fiercely guarded. The lord of the castle sat at the high table, usually on a raised platform, flanked by the most important nobles and knights. The closer you were to the Lord, the higher your status, closer to power and privilege. Sit too far down the table or on the floor, and you might as well be invisible. The scramble for spots wasn't just about comfort, it was a political chess game. Alliances were forged and grudges renewed over who got the best seat or who was forced to the far end with the servants. A misplaced chair could lead to scandal, and an empty seat next to the Lord was a silent insult that everyone noticed. Salt was more than a seasoning. It was a symbol of wealth and influence. In a time when spices were rare and costly imports, salt was the affordable luxury. Lords kept salt cellars as prized possessions, and a sprinkle of salt was a sign of favor. Passing the salt wasn't just about taste. It was a subtle reminder of who controlled resources. To be left out of the salt-sharing circle was a quiet but sharp social rebuke. Some salt cellars were even locked to prevent theft, turning the humble condiment into a guarded treasure. Conversation at the table was equally strategic. Stories were told, rumors spread, and loyalties tested between bites of tough meat or bitter pottage. Speaking out of turn could earn you a sharp glare or worse. Jesters and troubadours might entertain, but even they knew when to hold their tongues. Silence was as powerful as speech, and listening carefully could mean the difference between favor and exile. Meals were also noisy affairs. The clatter of wooden trenchers, the slap of greasy fingers wiping faces, and the occasional grunt or cough filled the air. There was no concept of polite table manners as we know them today. Burping or scratching was commonplace and rarely frowned upon. After all, cleanliness was a luxury, and everyone was too focused on survival to worry about proper etiquette. Still, within the chaos, the rules of hierarchy held firm, keeping the social order intact, even when the ale flowed freely. At the end of the meal, the leftover trenchers, now soaked in juices and bits of meat, were handed down to the poor waiting outside or to the household animals. Waste was minimal because food was precious, but it wasn't uncommon for scraps to be tossed out windows, sometimes with a shout of "Gardaloo" to warn passers-by below. This old French phrase literally meant "watch out below," a polite heads-up for anyone unfortunate enough to be strolling beneath the castle walls at mealtime. Dining in a medieval castle was never simple or purely about nourishment. It was a constant performance, a test of wit, patience, and social savvy. Every greasy finger, every stolen glance across the table, and every pinch of salt carried weight. The meal was a battlefield where alliances were built, reputations made or broken, and the delicate balance of power kept alive, one crumb at a time. As the sun sinks below the horizon, the medieval castle begins its slow descent into darkness, a darkness heavier than just the absence of light. Daylight was more than a comfort, it was a lifeline. When nightfall came, the castle's lively chaos folded into something quieter, but far from peaceful. The transition from the clatter of daytime to the muffled shadows of night was a ritual all its own, fraught with its own dangers and strict routines. Torches flicker as the last workers shuffle back to their quarters, their faces smeared with soot and exhaustion. The great hall, so vibrant during the day with its clanging dishes and loud conversations, grows still. Wooden shutters slam against the thick stone walls, barring out the chill and any unwanted intruders. The castle, with its massive stones and narrow windows, traps the day's cold, making the air inside feel like a damp cellar. There is no central heating here, just the fading embers of the hearth and layers of wool and linen clinging to bodies for warmth. Evening prayers echo softly through the chapel, a reminder that faith was a constant companion in the medieval world. Worship wasn't just spiritual. It was a measure of discipline and a chance to seek protection for the long night ahead. The priest's voice carries solemnly, offering blessings against the unseen evils lurking in the shadows, spirits, thieves, and sickness. Nighttime in a medieval castle was a realm of mystery and fear, where superstition ruled alongside sword and shield. Most castle inhabitants retreat to their cramped chambers or shared dormitories, but sleep isn't guaranteed. The stone floors groan, footsteps echo, and the wind howls through the narrow arrow slits, rattling wooden doors and dragging icy drafts through cracks. Rats scurry unseen, their tiny claws scratching at walls, and the occasional scurry across the sleeping quarters, ensuring no one is truly alone. Privacy is a forgotten luxury. Walls are thin, and whispers travel far in the stillness. The sounds of coughing or groaning remind everyone of the ever-present threat of illness. Some castle residents, especially the guards, stay alert, pacing the ramparts and courtyards, eyes sharp for any sign of trouble. Their shifts are long and unforgiving, punctuated by the occasional clang of armor or muffled shout. Night patrols aren't just about watching for enemies. They're a psychological battle against the eerie darkness and the tales of ghosts that haunt the ancient stone corridors. Many a guard swore they saw shadows move or heard footsteps where no one should be. Superstition was as much a tool of control as any sword, and night patrols kept both soldiers and spirits in check. Candles are precious and in short supply, burned sparingly to save wax and avoid drawing too much attention from outside. Their flickering light casts long, dancing shadows that make familiar corners seem sinister. In some castles, lanterns hung in the great hall and along passageways, but the light barely penetrated the vastness. This dimness made nighttime navigation a perilous affair. One wrong step down a stone stair, and you might end up bruised or worse, falling into a pit or a trap left over from the castle's defensive measures. Despite the cold, discomfort, and fear, life in the castle doesn't pause completely. Night brings quieter routines, the grinding of grain in the mill, the hushed conversations of servants finishing their chores, or the occasional furtive meeting between nobles in shadowed alcoves. Secret deals and whispered plots could be born in these hushed hours, the castle's political heartbeat never truly still. Sleep, when it comes, is rarely restful. Bedding was sparse and rough, often just straw mats or thin blankets, cold and sometimes damp from the stone floors. The common folk shared rooms, huddled together for warmth, while the nobility enjoyed feather beds and heavy tapestries, still nothing like modern comfort. Dreams were often disturbed by the cold, the noises, or worries about the next day's toils. Dawn was both an end and a beginning. Before the sun rose, the castle stirred again, preparing for the relentless cycle to start anew. The clanging of armor, the shouts of orders, and the smell of smoke from the kitchens filled the air. Life in a medieval castle was unforgiving and unceasing, an endless round of toil, fear, and fleeting moments of reprieve. Nightfall might bring darkness, but it never brought rest. The castle was a living organism, pulsing with the rhythms of survival, always ready to greet the chaos of a new day.